Beyond the Hedges. I'm your host, David Mansouri, and today we are talking about artificial intelligence with Fred Oswald. Fred is a professor here at Rice and the Herbert S. Autrey Chair in Social Sciences. Fred's research focuses on selection and job performance models in organizational, educational, and military contexts. He's also a member of the National Artificial Intelligence Committee, which advises the President and Secretary of Commerce on issues related to artificial intelligence. Fred, thanks so much for joining us today and for being our first guest of this new season.
How about that? Thanks, David, for hosting me. I look forward to the conversation here. It's a real pleasure to join you, and I'm thrilled to be invited.
Awesome. Well, just to start off, Fred, would love for you to talk just a little bit about your journey to Rice, to Houston. What brought you to the campus? What brought you to the city? And perhaps what brought you to the work that you're doing right now?
Sure. So what brought me to the campus, I suppose, was in high school when I was considering places to go for college. I applied to Rice and to UT Austin, and I ended up going to UT Austin. But and I got into both places. And in fact, the only thing I put on my office wall, it's not my degrees, it's my letter admitting me into Rice so that the undergraduates see that I have some street cred. But I eventually, as we all know, made the right, things went full circle, and I came back to Rice after my undergraduate training at UT Austin in psychology and graduate training at University of Minnesota in industrial organizational psychology. And that brings me to my research, which you were mentioning, which is about developing all kinds of tests that might be used within organizations for hiring and within educational settings for understanding student skills and where they're at. And because I've worked in both educational and work settings, I also do research on the school to work kind of pathways that people take. So not to be reductionistic about it and say that there's one best way. And in nature, of course, you see all kinds of different pathways. But what do they look like, and how can we improve them? As we know from our lives, a little information can go a long way to put people on paths that are better fitting for them.
So I want to dig a little bit, Fred, maybe into the research specifically that you're doing at Rice. You have your own lab here at Rice, the Organization and Workforce Laboratory, which I believe the acronym for that is OWL,
That's
which
right.
is very fitting. So could you talk about what work goes on in your lab? What are the students, at the graduate or undergraduate level doing in your lab? What are the things that you're researching and studying?
Sure. So the research varies. It's all under that umbrella that I just described around, developing and understanding tests that are used within organizations. Those types of tests are often centered around skills. Could be job knowledge. They're centered around personality and attitude type measures. And we could get into that, but the sort of soft skills are needed within organizations as much as technical skills. And then also measuring interest. So my students will vary on those themes depending on their own interests. So I have a student who just graduated, Felix Wu, who, by the way, was an undergraduate at Rice as well. So he really spent a lot of time here at Rice and really got the most out of it, clearly, and is interested in disability in the workplace and how do AI technologies stand to empower those with disabilities, but also perhaps cause some barriers or some limitations as well. And so his work dealt with how to understand that landscape. He also looked at the contextual kind of features that support disabled workers, whether that's the kind of accommodations that organizations are legally obliged to provide, but also the social support systems that people have, parents and peers and family and so on. Carissa Corey is a current student of mine. She investigates how employment discrimination cases play out in court in terms of the statistical information that is attended to. And her work looks then at how can we communicate statistics more clearly and effectively in those settings. How do you translate data into information, basically? You can compute statistics all day on employment, hiring rates, but how do you communicate that into what may or may not be a discrimination case? And that would then supplement the other important information that leads to those determinations. And then finally, Enga Wang is a student of mine who is studying large language models and how, we talk about AI capturing biases based on the data that it uses and applies algorithms to. How does that actually look when you train models on data that represent, human foibles in their recall of events? Humans have their flaws, and how does that get reflected in the data? And he's done some work showing how, data that are text-based, more conversational, can show more biases than the types of quantitative data that he was looking at. It's not that statistics can also have their biases, but he shows that when there's a numeric way of explaining something that humans may rely on their intuitions for, those examples tend to be more correct. And so the large language models capitalize on that if they're fed the quantitative data. And again, this is for a very specific situation. So again, there could be other data where humans can be correct too. It just depends on the data that are being used. But this really demonstrated the biases that can happen in natural language. Rebecca Chen is yet another student of mine, and she is looking at the claims that vendors of employment tests are making when they say they have AI used in the test. So when vendors say, for example, that their test is unbiased, the question then is, well, can you give us some data showing that it's unbiased? Can you give us a technical report? How, how are you supporting your claims? And also even, are these tests measuring job relevant skills? Are they measuring job knowledge, like you say? Are they measuring conscientiousness, like you say? How do we know that? What kinds of technical reports can you provide? And how do those reports align with professional standards, which have existed for decades for developing tests in a way that is reliable and predictive of outcomes and fair to everyone who takes those tests? So that rounds out my lineup of students. And it's exciting to work with them all. And, it always stretches me as a professor our job is to explore new ideas, and students are very inspiring to take us into new directions in our research.
So I want to dig into those last two sets of work that you mentioned and talk more specifically about artificial intelligence applications and how this connects in your work. And as you mentioned, your lab is working on the application of AI, the ethics of AI in organizational decision making and HR talent decision making. And would love for you to talk maybe a little bit more about what that looks like. What are the things, maybe just, in your own sort of research and kind of curiosity on this topic, what are the things that you're seeking to pursue or understand better, particularly as the rest of the world is also trying to understand how to use these tools in lots of different aspects of life?
Right. Well, my research and also the work I do with the National AI Advisory Committee that you mentioned. I'm also part of a National Academies. I chair what's called the Board on Human Systems Integration. It's a fancy title there, but really what they're doing is looking at how humans interact with all kinds of technologies, and not to forget the so-called human in the loop, and ensure that the needs of people, the way the tools are used, the ethics, all these things that are outside of the algorithms are being considered. So the research I described with my graduate students pertaining to how to develop more reliable and effective employment tests, though that part is really interesting and important, but it's kind of more it's research, it's micro, it's data, it's getting your hands dirty to try and understand how these tests work. And I mentioned bias. How does bias work when we talk about AI as bias? Well, what does that really mean in terms of the data and the decisions that are made from those data? Um, and then this work gets embedded in these in organizations. So I'm not only concerned with the development of tests, but I'm concerned about how they're the context in which they're being used. So you have to think about, for example, the recruitment pipeline that leads into the people that you select. And so AI can be used to do recruiting. And you can get an organization can get thousands upon thousands of applications as a function of AI. And then still other AI products can be used to winnow that down to a pile of applicants that you might then consider and apply more specific hiring tools to tests and interviews and so on. There are a couple of comments to make about that point. One is it makes you wonder whether AI is starting fires and selling the fire extinguishers at the same time, right? They give you a flood of applicants, many of which may not be relevant. But then another AI vendor comes along and says, "Hey, we'll put out this fire for you. We'll winnow it down." So I think about that a lot about essentially who is a serious applicant. And AI tools to be clear, AI tools stand to benefit employers by being more inclusive. So it's not that you shouldn't have a large number of people, it's just that those numbers should be relevant to those you might eventually hire. And sometimes I worry, absent data showing otherwise, I worry that the pool of applicants being considered is maybe not as strategic as you might want.
And Fred, maybe real quick, just to go a little bit deeper. I mean, if someone doesn't know a ton about talent management or like HR management, could you give an example of like what one of these tools literally is and what it literally is doing?
Sure. It is a little opaque, even for those in the trenches like myself. I'll give you a rough example, a caricature, I guess, but here's how it might work. Let's say that a company is using an asynchronous video interview, AVI as they call it. And that's where you may have taken one of these yourself or know someone who has. They're so widespread, but it's where an applicant is given interview questions, perhaps even in advance, and they then record their answers to those questions. And even if they weren't provided them in advance, they may be given the opportunity to re-record their answers. So it's not two-way; it's more like one-way type of interview. Which, by the way, is getting more two-way now that we have chat GPTs, and chatbots. Interviews can be more interactive. But these AVIs are still being used. And what might happen is that the videos get captured by companies selling these tests. And the video capture then gets scored using these machine learning algorithms where the language is scored and perhaps the intonation of the language is scored, which is a bit questionable. Intonation of language and your facial features and things like that are just not relevant to the job. And yet they might be scored by these algorithms.
Yeah, right.
They might be scored by third parties. So the video cap, the testing company selling these asynchronous video interviews, they're capturing the video, they're sending it to a third party that applies these machine learning algorithms. The scores come back, and then the company that sells the test does the job of creating reports. So something like a red, yellow, green notion of who may be more favorable for hiring versus less favorable for hiring. And that assists the HR decision maker because they want to be able to make decisions faster. And so these tools providing the red, yellow, green report assist in that need for speed, so to speak. And the need for speed is not to be discounted. The AI vendors of employment tests promote the fact that it's faster, it's more scalable across large numbers of people, it's cheaper per person, it's more convenient because the applicant can take the interview on their cell phone on the bus or something like that. Um, but among all those potential advantages, what I didn't list was effectiveness. How do we know, and this has been my job well prior to AI, how do we know that a measure measures what we think it measures? What kind of data can we marshal to ensure that these things are the case and that the things that you are selecting an applicant on are in fact relevant to the job, fair to everybody involved in the selection process, and will reach the outcomes that the employer is hoping for, if not the employees themselves, so they get raises and keep their job.
And then do you see, Fred, one of the things that I feel like I hear a lot in conversations about using AI in different professional settings is questions around ethics related to that use. And um, I wonder how that plays out in this conversation around employment decisions or hiring decisions. Are there, is there sort of a bar for how you think about the ethical use of these tools? And it also feels like it's changing so rapidly too, and so quickly that it may even be hard to know as the work shifts. But I'd just be curious about your thoughts on maybe more broadly the ethics of using artificial intelligence for making these kinds of important talent and human capital decisions.
Yeah, great question. So, as you mentioned, AI is proceeding so rapidly that our understanding, by the time we understand some aspect of AI, AI itself might be changing quickly, and the ethics associated with it may be changing as well. But there are some fundamentals that are not changing around data privacy, ensuring that applicant data are not being sold to the highest bidder, for example, and the European Union with the AI Act that will, at least for talent management, will come into effect less than 2 years, maybe a year and a half. Um, that kind of follows on to GDPR and data privacy regulation within Europe. Um, the U.S. is a little more uneven in a sense that state laws are often it's cut and paste legislation where states end up with similar legislation by virtue of using the same types of text. But the way these get implemented is a bit uneven, whether it's data protection or ensuring that tests are indeed hiring at the very least in a way that doesn't discriminate against protected subgroups by race or gender, for example. But beyond that, the ethics of AI testing is often put on the laps of the hiring organizations. They need to be able to ask the right questions about AI tools. And a lot more education needs to be done in that respect. There are a lot of well-meaning organizations that will use AI tools, but not know necessarily about the outcomes, whether they're effective or ineffective for that matter. Um, I'll go back to the example of where an AI tool can bring an organization thousands of recruits, and they might say, we'll winnow it down to the top 5%, and then you can apply whatever methods you like beyond that, like an interview, et cetera, to get your best employees. Well, that sounds great because AI, after all, is sophisticated and should be able to get you that best 5%. But the experiment these companies don't run is whether what if you selected 5% at random out of those thousand? And then told the organization to apply the same procedures they would otherwise with an interview and so on. Would they end up with employees that are just as good? And how would you know? And so that's just a one example out of many where organizations need to be more discerning about how they use these tools, what tools they choose. But that is incumbent on test vendors providing enough information to the consumer, the organization, in order to be discerning. So we need a better dialogue, I suppose, between those selling tests and those wanting to use tests for effectiveness in organizations. And they both parties stand to benefit, right? Those creating tests will get more consumers in the hopes that they compete on effectiveness, and they compete on ethics, and they compete on fair and effective testing within organizations.
Oof. I could imagine a tension that might come up with some of these companies who are using these tools or thinking about how to use these tools is a trust or an openness to using these tools as supports in their hiring processes, while at the same time, perhaps a bit of a concern that those tools might replace some of the work that those folks that are working in the talent space are actually doing. And I'm wondering if you hear that in the conversations that you have with employers or folks who are using these tools.
Yeah, I've heard that in the employment space and in the education space. And so there are these um, tensions in the relationship between people and AI, such that you want AI to make your job better, empower you in your role, but yet not replace you. And so, what is the right balance there? And, I think there's some data showing that, for example, that AI can do a lot of creative work, or AI can also do a lot of kind of routine work, like paralegals that are drafting contracts. I don't pretend to be a legal expert, by the way, but apparently AI can carry out some relatively routine tasks, as well as these creative tasks, perhaps, replacing jobs and not just enhancing workers. So that is a real tension. I think there's another tension in organizations where an organization may be risk averse, as they may tend to be, and not use AI tools for fear of data privacy issues or proprietary data somehow getting into the stream of data that a vendor is using to train their models. Those types of cautions are legitimate. But a tension with that issue is the fact that employees may go rogue, so to speak, and buy their own tools on their own, use them on their own, sign away their whatever privacy, kind of issues that are in the contracts. They click a button and agree to, and so it is a tension because I think in organizations it's very useful. AI or otherwise, to have shared experiences and benefit from them. So if people are using AI tools together, like HR professionals when they're hiring talent, if they're using the same tools, they can talk about those tools, what worked for them and what didn't. Similar to, us, we probably both use MS Word and MS Excel and, other tools in common, and we can talk about them. So I think that that's definitely a tension that's in place, and potentially it's an equity issue because employees that have more resources can afford these tools.
Yeah. One person I've been following on this topic, who I'm sure you've read his work as well, as Ethan Mollick at
Ethan Mollick, I knew it.
Wharton School. Yeah, who I think like has this concept of saying that we're really sort of encouraging people to actually use these tools so that they know what they can do and what they can't, because it's not necessarily a clear all the time what these tools are able to do. And I think he calls it sort of the jagged edge. Go to the jagged edge of where these tools can be useful and where they can't. And it seems to me like in lots of different applications of AI tools, it's unclear what these tools can do and what they're good at, and perhaps is a reason why professionals in a number of different fields should be sort of considering how to experiment with these tools to really understand what they can do and what they can.
Exactly. Yeah, I definitely agree with you that you create relatively safe environments, right, to experiment where you can see what you can and can't do, understand the limitations, understand the benefits, and then see how that can be incorporated in your job. I've noticed in my own experimentation, no surprise, because I think this is a common experience. Um, with generative AI, with the language models, you often become a critic in ways that you of course criticize or revise your own work, but when a GPT is producing language, say summarize this paper for me or something like that, you shift into the role of a critic and say, is this good enough? However you define that, good enough for you, good enough for your audience, your stakeholders, and both in terms of the thematic, the substance, what is there, does it seem right, but also critically, what is missing, what didn't show up, um, and really working with that, I think changes your um, kind of your approach to how you do some of that work. One example is where I had a long list of divisions of an organization, and I wanted to figure out how they might be best clustered into similar divisions. How many groups of divisions are there in the data? And I'm like, let me ask GPT to group these. And sure enough, they did a pretty good job. Here's an operations kind of group, here's a legal group, here's a technical group, et cetera. Um, Except there was a critical aspect to this. Two groups were missing. Two of the divisions were missing, entirely missing. I I did not, I told the GPT to group the divisions. I even gave it a category called others, saying, look, this is a parking lot for the ones that don't fit. And still, it omitted two groups. Like, oh my God, like if this was high stakes work, that would be a real problem unless you were a critic. So I think that's a problem, but I think this work, that type of issue translates into organizations and our students. At Rice University, we're thinking about how AI should be used in the classroom, and professors are given leeway for deciding on what their policy is, and we're focused on evolving that policy to see what works and what doesn't when we implement AI in the classroom.
So that's a great segue to maybe my last question related to AI, and then we can maybe zoom out to a couple other topics. But I'm very interested. The organization I lead is very interested right now in thinking about how AI tools could be used to improve and support teaching and learning, both in the K-12 space, but also in the higher ed space, and have been very following very closely applications for AI tools for things like tutoring in the K-12 space, and tools like Conmigo, which I think have a lot of promise. There are some tools that we've looked at recently that can provide, as an example, teachers feedback on their classroom instruction right after the class ends, and share perspective on how engaging they were, what topics they need to follow up on in the next course. And then even things in the higher education space around, as an example, student advising and coaching support, right? And helping students make decisions about what classes they should take, or even advising support around sort of topics that they may need to spend more time on. And so I'm curious about just your thoughts on the applications of AI in education. You gave some examples of how you're thinking about this at Rice in particular, but wondering if there are any things that are on your radar as particularly, I don't know, promising ways of using these tools, and maybe any cautions that are top of mind for you as more and more both educators and, I'm sure, students are using these tools in education work.
hmm Um, so this summer, I was invited to speak at this event hosted by the American Federation of Teachers, and who partnered with Microsoft. And I agreed to speak in part because I wondered about this partnership. Why would a teachers union partner with a multi-trillion-dollar organization? And it turns out it's because of this tension that I illustrated earlier, that um, teachers want to be knowledgeable of AI, empowered with AI, use it to improve their pedagogy in the classroom, their ability to work with students and get that dynamic feedback that you mentioned, and be able to be using similar tools that students are using, so they all can again talk about using similar products. This is a money making proposition for Microsoft, of course, but assuming Microsoft enters the relationship in good faith, and by every appearance they are. They want to understand what is going on in the classroom in order to make those tools more effective for teachers and for students alike. And the way to think about this is that if you don't do that, if you don't have these partnerships, and you have people try to use AI tools on their own, I guess I'm a researcher, so that I view that as an experiment. You could collect data on that and see which scenarios are better and which ones are worse, including the scenario of no AI. What if we don't use AI at all? And evaluate those situations on a number of different dimensions, not just the effectiveness dimension, which is clearly important, but also the ethical dimensions around privacy and equity and so on. So I think that's very important. Um, some of the ways we can use it in education are pretty interesting in terms of, if a teacher needed to generate a template for a syllabus that they would then expand, well, AI could do that for you. They could put in the dates. You give GPT the school calendar, and it'll figure out the dates for you and generate it, that kind of thing, or generate PowerPoint slides, at least a skeleton that, again, you need to be a critic. You need to build on it and be the human in the loop. But if it can incorporate your materials and generate some talking points that you would then embellish and extend to your liking, that seems great. Students could do the same thing there with their own presentations. And let's not kid ourselves. They are doing it. The professors that wonder about how AI is taking place in the classroom and what their policies should be, they need to understand that students are already doing this. Rice students are, it turns out, very smart and resourceful. And I don't think they use AI wholesale as a cheat machine in a sense, because it wouldn't be a good product given their talents, and it wouldn't reach their goals of developing real skills. My point earlier about being a critic of what comes out of AI assumes that you have the critical skills in order to do that. And so you really do have to build the fundamentals in order to understand what AI is doing. So in that sense, we always have to, we can't use AI as a crutch. We have to use it as a way to empower the talents we already have and are building ourselves.
So I'd love to zoom out, Fred, and talk about, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about some of the work you're doing around tests and aptitudes and understanding skills that employers are looking for. I feel like a larger conversation that is happening perhaps across the country is, how are employers making decisions about what employees they are hiring? What skills are they looking for? And even a wondering about the extent to which a degree or a credential actually matters in the hiring process that employers are leading. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what that work looks like that you're doing, the research that you're doing in that space. What kinds of tests are you exploring? What are you hearing from employers as they're continuing to evolve their hiring practices? Would love for you to just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think the discussion of AI is, in a way, a shorthand for being able to discuss everything that AI affects. It's a way of bringing people together to talk about skills in the workplace and to understand, what are we hiring for anyway, and why are we doing that? Right? It's a valuable. My point is, it's a valuable conversation to have, even if AI weren't in the picture. It's to ask seriously, what is an organization trying to do in meeting its goals, and then how you do it is AI and otherwise. And so, in terms of measuring skills, whether you're using AI or not, a common approach within my field of industrial organizational psychology is to conduct what's called a job analysis, which sounds, I don't know, sciencey or something, but there are so many different ways to conduct a job analysis. But the point behind it is to understand the skills that are needed within the job. So the person side of the equation, but also the environment side of the equation. What are the contextual features that drive performance? Whether that's team structures or the physical environment, the incentives that are provided to workers, et cetera. And so, looking at the person and the environment side of the coin in a systematic way, making sure you don't forget certain aspects, and I think that's our value as organizational psychologists is to have that systematic approach. It's like anybody could come up with a list, I suppose, but they might forget certain aspects and not have the experience of how to measure those relevant characteristics and when to measure them, which it's one thing to say these skills are relevant for the job and you need to identify those. It's another thing to say, these skills are relevant for selection. To be skills based is a direction that people are always talking about. I think for some jobs, there you may not be able to do that. Like for entry level jobs where the skills have not been obtained yet, what do you select on, right? So that's why measures of personality or general knowledge get used because those are the types of things that you can get information on before they actually accumulate those skills within a job. Once they have those skills, then those perhaps could be used for selection in future jobs.
And then how do you see this focus on skills-based hiring or thinking very intentionally about skills? How does that play out or how should that be playing out in education? Because you could argue, I mean, I feel like we see all the time, uh, perhaps a shift in both education institutions and in students asking, well, what's the actual training or set of skills that I need for this job? And it may not look the same as it always did in the past, right? It might be this credential and this certificate, and that stacks to this different kind of degree that is really kind of perhaps a little bit of a marketplace of educational experiences as opposed to sort of the traditional way we've thought about educational experiences. Thoughts on that? Is that something you're seeing in your work?
Definitely, we see the educational institutions trying to ensure that that work is the destination of education, right? So we're trying to ensure that employment is at the end of the road, and that can happen in a variety of ways. It can be through direct partnerships, like community colleges and technical colleges might partner with industry to ensure that once they're trained in the health professions or in being an electrician or a welder, that actually ends up with viable employment possibilities with organizations. And those are more direct pipelines. There are also less direct pipelines where general skills are being developed that will be used in organizations, but they'll be shaped a little bit in terms of how they get used. And I think that happens a lot, right? With our Rice graduates, they come out with a whole suite of skills that they learned in school, in addition to general critical thinking skills that then get refined within organizations. Sometimes you have organizational leaders saying, well, it turns out the only thing I've ever needed in talent management was to select on soft skills. If they are a team player and can work with others, we can do anything with them. That's true to some extent, but I would argue that maybe that's their focus because there is a certain high level of technical knowledge in place. So someone who leads an engineering firm probably would not want to just hire anybody who doesn't have the technical skills. Those are still necessary, but the spirit of the point is still understood that once that's in place, there's some level of technical knowledge. Then so much more happens within organizations that, frankly, I don't do research on. What is it like to form effective teams, ensure they're coordinated, make sure they work safely and effectively. How do managers, work within those systems to improve performance within teams, within individuals. I mean, that's actually part of my discipline of industrial organizational psychology is to focus on those types of issues. But I tend to focus myself more on the front end in terms of selection, recruiting. But that's obviously very important too. So I wonder, sorry, just one more point is around skills is I do think about how it's an opportunity to revisit how applicants should be applying for jobs. So AI technologies will promote the fact that they can scrape resumes and other personal statements and other materials that might come in with an application, um, interview content and so on. But would it to what extent should those materials be more structured so that if you have the time, if the applicants have the time, they can structure that information that would be better for the applicant and the employer alike. It's not that AI would be necessarily taken out of the loop, but ensuring that the information is there in the first place, I think is an important part of that system.
Great. All right. So to end, Fred, we're going to totally change gears here and ask you a couple of rapid fire questions at the end of our conversation that are totally unrelated to AI and hiring and some of the conversations we've been having so far. So first, what's your favorite spot on the Rice campus?
Oh, my favorite spot on the Rice campus. Well, it's the quad is looking interesting, right? It just got redesigned, and I have to say, I just took a walk through the quad and started out, a little skeptical. I'd never seen it before. I didn't know what it would be like, and I walked across and got to the end of the quad where my office is essentially in Sewell Hall, and I thought, wow, that is a great environment, for students to commune and just to hang out and really, it's really a nice place. They did a great job with that. So I guess based on my prior experiences with other places, I'd have to say Valhalla is not bad at the end of a long day.
Love it. Love it. All right. Next, what's the best book you've read recently? Or a book you'd recommend that you've read in the last year or so?
Well, you mentioned Ethan Malik, and I'll say that his book, Co-Intelligence, is very interesting and useful and reflects, his own experience. And you mentioned the need to experiment. He's experimented with all kinds of AI. So I definitely recommend reading that book and trying out AI yourself. Sorry, you said we weren't going to talk about AI, but here we are again. I think I would really recommend that to give people a broader aperture on what AI can do from somebody who thinks about it a lot.
And Fred, I don't know if you can see behind me. The second book on this shelf right here is Co-Intelligence.
Oh,
right
okay.
There.
Well, there you
this
go.
This is the book. This is the list of the stack of books that I typically recommend to people that I've read recently. So I love that you mentioned that one.
All right, we have something in common there.
That's right. All right, and then my last question. So, as you know, when students apply to Rice, they are presented with the box. Right, the box is a question on the application where they share an image of something that appeals to them or something they're interested in or that shares more about themselves or something that's meaningful to them. And I was going to ask you what image would you put in your box, but because now I know that you applied to Rice and got into Rice, I wonder what image did you put in your box?
Honestly, I don't remember if there was a box back in 1988, but I would say that if I were presented with a box today, I would try to cram some life in there. So my wife would go in there, maybe a few cats. We have cats. I would put a pinball machine in there, a picture anyway, cram it in there. That's my one luxury item I've bought in my life, I would say, is Adam's Family pinball machine. And then maybe a Scrabble tile. I play Scrabble now and then. So
That's great. Awesome. Well, Fred, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for sharing about the important and really interesting research you're doing and the things that you're really advancing in this space that's rapidly changing. And appreciate the time today and really, again, really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks
yeah,
for being with
likewise,
us.
David. Thanks a lot. Again, it's a real pleasure to inaugurate this podcast, and this topic is never ending in its complexity and interestingness. So I hope to be able to continue the conversation with others in the Rice community and others who may be listening here.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.